Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, in a bit of a bumper episode, we're trying something a little different. Fellow podcaster James, or Metanomad from Hermitix, is my guest this week, and I am also his. And as my guest, he's on, I guess, my show, so that he can shed some light or insights on maybe some conceptual tools or critiques you may not be aware of or maybe less aware of regarding coming to terms with this moment or power in general. And I'm a guest on his show to talk about magic versus occultism, the state of magic, magic and meaning in the world, that kind of stuff. So to a large extent, it's a case of the blind podcasters and the elephant. And that particular elephant is not just what to do with this moment, but also how to solve for meaning when solutionism in all its forms is part of this moment. So settle in. So, James, what happens when two podcasts who both have like a traditional or well-known first question attempt what the kids call a swapcast? Who goes first?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this. We've both got the questions. And you said about, this is called a swapcast, and it's like, it made me feel so old. I'm in podcasting and I hadn't. I don't really know what it is. It's like, I don't know, the old man in me was thinking, what, just two podcasts meet up, do they? So yeah, I mean, you go. You ask your question. And then we'll...
All right, that's good. I mean, I've been preparing my answer. Most people who come on my show, I sort of think, I wonder how I would answer that. But I've got mine. It's been like planning a wedding, getting my answer to yours. But James, were you a weird kid?
This is one of those things in retrospect. At the time, I didn't think I was, but then I look back and I think I sort of pushed away a lot of the loves that I had, and like I'm refinding them now. So I was just really into drinking in high school, and that meant I just didn't read all that much. Like I didn't properly get into reading until I was sort of in college, British college, so like 17, 18, and then like as soon as I moved away from drinking, I was like, man, there's all these things I should have been doing when I was a kid, like reading sci-fi and reading occult stuff and weird stuff. So I was like, it's almost like a Jungian thing. I've had my childhood that I was meant to have, because in school I was too caught up in, school games and things like that. But yeah, I mean, that's a roundabout way of saying, yeah, I was a weird kid.
So, I mean, pushing away loves, you didn't push away drinking, but underage drinking is its own kind of chaotic fun. I managed to find at least my intro books, the sort of Robert Anton Wilson stuff, whilst in underage drinking, I guess. But did you have any kind of unusual experiences that you would subsequently reframe as you went on more of like a reading journey? This is the have you been abducted by aliens or did you live in a haunted house type question.
I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and I had more like Balladian experiences of so living in a small rural town, which is sort of a lot of the architecture was 70s and nothing here is really updated, and then anything that's built was new, so there was massive juxtapositions everywhere, which isn't something you notice as a kid because obviously you're not sort of smart enough or intuitive enough to do that. But then as you get older, you realize that that's all had an effect on you, and this idea of sort of like a Balladian sort of combustion of times all in one place, where you just feel like you can't really anchor onto anything. You know, the quaint aspects of the town that I grew up in were just so not what was going on in the media or in modernity. So it was more of like a Balladian thing. I've had one near death experience where a remote control airplane, which was like I don't know, I think a 6-foot wingspan. I was sat in the back of an estate car, and it flew to, like, the blades were about an inch away from my stomach, and it slammed past me. That was a very strange experience, and it was almost out of body. I remember looking at myself sat on the back of the car as this plane slammed into the back. And then one of my earliest memories, I was thinking about this the other day actually, is so this is like probably where a lot of my scorn for modernity comes from. It must be really early memory as well, because I was walking next to the pushchair that I was meant to be in, though that might not be true. I might have just muddled this up. But it was a lane near my house, and all the trees were still are actually overgrown over the top of the lane. And there was I never saw him do it, or it could have been a woman, but there was someone who used to bag up their dog shit and throw it up so that it would then come down and hang from these branches. And this lane was just like, you had to sort of run just to avoid these falling bags of dog shit. And it was like that for years. And no one ever like sort of said to the person. And that sort of, for me, that was just like a metaphor for modernity in a way. It's like, I don't know. It's so Balladian that I still can't get a grasp of what the hell was going on there. But there's a lot of moments like that. But I haven't had too many occult experiences, really.
No, fair enough.
No.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Is that a good answer to your...
It is. It's a very you answer, I think. I think I know what you mean about Balladian, but it is a kind of the Son of Man has no place to lay his head in the kind of Gospel of Thomas sense. It's like I was the weirdest thing about the world was how it was arranged as I grew up. You know, like, what the fuck? That is weird. And it's also like distinctly British, I think, that there's a lane where someone's doing that with dog shit and no one tells them about it.
Oh, of course not. No one would dare, comment. Wow, how dare you? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess I should ask you the question back. It's strange doing it this way. But Gordon White, 3 thinkers living or dead into a room, the Hermitix question. Who do you pick?
And what I've always wanted to know, because I think some people, which I would like to do, is treat it like a dinner party, or is it more like a room where I'm watching them in a lab coat through a one-way mirror?
That decision is up to you. I mean, the first ever time I did this, I didn't actually think of it as a dinner party, but the guest went, if I had them around for dinner. And I thought, actually, that sort of works better, because there's a lot that goes on with the act of eating with respect to a lot of figures that I think would be interesting. So if you get,
I think so too. It also means I can extend the numbers past 3 and say I'm bringing a date. But
okay.
My 3 are Bill Naiji, Maria Sabina, and it's funny you mentioned Jungian. The other one would be C.G. Jung. And Bill Naiji was a Aboriginal elder from northern Australia, a bunch of different places. And Maria Sabina was the Mazatec curandera who gave R. Gordon Wasson mushrooms in the mid-20th century. And I think my thinking behind those 3 is they all are ambassadors for ways into the imaginal, and more importantly, how you make the imaginal something vibrant and alive in your waking life, because you're dealing with Aboriginal dreaming models. You're dealing with Jung attempting that very process with the theory of mind he gets from 19th century Europe. And Maria Sabina represents that kind of, she was, amongst other things, she wasn't just a mushroom pusher, right? Like, she was an artist and curandera, and she composed her own whilst in spirit, actually quite impressive, like poetry and invocations and what have you. But you've got the kind of entheogenic route, you've got the lived Bill Naiji route, and I just think between them, and if it was a dinner party and I was bringing a date, I'd bring Ursula Le Guin, because I think she would have the kind of questions I'd want to table to my guests. She'd think of better questions than I would to table to my guests about essentially bringing the imaginal. What what modes of being alive allow for the imaginal to have that kind of increased vibrancy and agency, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the reason you picked them is three clear entries into thinking in alternative ways.
Sort of. Like, even that, this is the trouble with it, isn't it? That framing, I think we think in alternative ways. I think it's a sort of West and the rest, right? I think Jung, towards the end of his life, knew that when he visited Africa and Navajo lands and things, right? So I think it's more, what could Jung have done with more horizontal access to other theories of mind as expressed by Mazatec curanderas and Aboriginal elders, because he gave it his best shot in many respects, but just how European power works and how the European theory of mind he was at. And it's funny, you read his books about him in Africa and he's taking all this stuff very seriously, but he's still using acronyms like the Negroes and whatever. And you think, God, and obviously he did. Like, this is a, early 20th century book. And you think if you could put someone who had that capacity to immanentize that sort of imaginal process in dialogue with people who are instantiations of, I would argue, like more sophisticated ways of doing it, I think you'd get something incredible out of, additionally incredible out of Jung, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you think that's a big problem that we're having? It's obviously a big problem, the idea of Western thought, being this invasive thing where, as you sort of rightly called me out, the idea of alternative ways of thinking is already sort of applying this idea that there's a normal way to think, which is obviously a huge problem personally for me, but I imagine it is for you as well.
Yeah, so, and I deliberately used West and the rest because anthropology historically goes, West is best from sort of the 1800s to mid-20th century, West and the rest to the end of the 20th century, and then you kind of get the sort of Bruno Latour, we've never been modern, and then you get the sort of non-Europeans like De Castro saying West and the rest itself is a framing that is unhelpful in cross-cultural encounters, right? So it's really, really challenging, and it's just a thing that I think it's almost strategic. I think it would fix more things or improve more things to prioritize the sort of rewilding or jailbreaking of a theory of mind, especially as this is a thing we can do now. But it's not that's the one thing, even separating them out. All of these challenges are all downstream from the same kind of afflictions that hit other stuff that I'm very interested in. So, political activity and all the rest of it. It's all that same, almost like classically Cartesian hijack, and that's a real challenge. So yes, it is the case in theory of mind that I think that's a problem, but I think it's a symptom of the actual problem.
Okay. So one of the big questions that I think was probably going to come up here is, as we're both full-time podcasters on roughly the same, we have a huge overlap, basically. What do you think the state of the dialogue is at the moment with this stuff?
It's the public dialogue is the worst anyone's ever seen it who is our approximate age, right? The private dialogue is pretty good. This is a weird thing about this moment, right? So there was, and I think he called the top of the cancel culture market. But when Matt Taibbi wrote that piece at the beginning of June, basically saying the American media has lost its mind, and so has the American left, and it feels really good to say it. It all has kind of historical resonances with the last few years of East Germany, where everyone's saying the official thing publicly, but either thinking differently, or in the few instances where they could speak privately, doing that. And I think the trouble is, and why I sort of have written a few pieces about it of late, is that makes everything worse. So there's sort of two things going on. It's like, well, can you critique a progressive cosmology? Yes, you absolutely can, but almost more urgently, you should, because the activities of people identifying as progressive at the moment are making progressive goals further away. So it's like, at what point, as someone who would identify as progressive, do you look at your actions and go, like, progress is in the word. It is the kind of moral and physical improvement via expertisism of a polity. And that's why I think it can be critiqued. I think that's in many respects rubbish. But by the same token, if that's what you are identifying with and your actions take you further away from that, what the hell? And that's been the really interesting challenge, is how you have a conversation that has to kind of paradigm up to the next level, where you sort of bracket the entire thing from internal, like progressivism and internal progressive critiques. You kind of have to bracket that and jump up and treat it in some sort of phenomenological algebra, and go, okay, well, we need to actually now critique the spectrum rather than pieces on it, because if not, and I mean, funnily enough, because my first question to you is, I want a definition for people who listen to my show for what accelerationism is, and it's kind of like where I'm at the moment is, because not coming from or put it this way, coming from a more haunted, in the actual spirit-based sense, not the ersatz animus sense that we get it from Derrida and everyone else. Coming from a world or a cosmos that's alive, there is some sort of fatalistic component to that, which is like, this is just sort of what happens now. And interestingly, we do have almost like, atheist is too far, non-magical framings for a similar idea. And it seems to me that accelerationism is something like that, where my opinions of it, or the challenges that are the intra-left challenges, are irrelevant, because this is just what happens now. And to the point that, can we fix it? Like, is the idea that we can fix it part of the problem? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean, and it's, you have a good understanding of it already. The idea of like the big question of accelerationism, I guess, it could revolve around this idea of fixing things, which is the implication of agency. So like, this is the thing that I always want to make clear when I talk about accelerationism now, is that if people don't know what it is and they look it up, they're going to find the first 2 pages of Google are going to be articles explaining why it's a white supremacist movement. And I want to make it explicit that it just isn't that.
Hey, look, I'm a chaos magician. Don't you remember the Trump election? Apparently he was a chaos magician. So
yeah,
we're familiar with the process. You Google it.
Yeah, oh yeah.
The first few results are like, oh, this appears to be a white supremacy cult. It's not. But anyway, carry on, because this is so useful and medicinal for people.
I mean, so those articles made the fact that it was my master's thesis quite awkward at times, I must admit, especially because they were published very, very shortly after. And I was like, oh man, I'm going to have to tell my tutor that it's really not this. I haven't, written my master's thesis on like pro-white, white supremacism, whatever. So explicitly, because I did an interview about accelerationism recently, and someone said like, you didn't really spend enough time explaining why it isn't that thing. So I think, firstly, I'll just say it isn't, and if you think it is, you're wrong. But the problem is you're only part wrong. This is a difficulty because we can't avoid that. So accelerationism, in short, is the idea that capitalism can't be stopped. It's what we've got. There's a process underlying it which is positive oriented, and it's compounding. So capitalism seeks at all times simply to build itself larger, greater, more productive, faster, more efficient. That's every single one of its processes is targeted towards that. And accelerationism makes the point that if that isn't going to be stopped anytime soon, and this is what we've got, then perhaps the best thing we can do is actually accelerate, is push all of this to its absolute limit. Because one of the problems of capitalism is that even if you try to do a return, it will subsume that return into its system and that will actually be the future you have. So we're seeing basically the future now is just consistently recycled. I mean, we're seeing a lot of the 80s come back in the sense of music. We're seeing a lot of traditionalism come back in the form of LARPing. And basically you could say traditions are coming back, but capitalism is just using them as an aesthetic to bolster sort of the profitable aspects of those identitarian movements in politics. So what returns is never the true thing, because the true thing is of course gone. So you can't within capitalism, you can't ever go back to pre-capitalism, because anything which you try to do will be subsumed into its system. So the point is you either go forward or stand still. And the point of that really is that the right, the left, the centre, conservative, left, fascist, whatever, all agree to a certain extent on one point, which is we haven't got the system that any of us want.
Yeah.
And even if you were capitalist, this isn't the capitalism that anyone wants. I mean, conservatives would probably like a more a relatively more open capitalism, which apparently conserves some things, though I basically think the conservative idea is gone and it's quite frankly meaningless. Leftism would probably like a capitalism which just has far more in with what they would like a socialism, but they probably still would now want some market elements which allow many of the freedoms which capitalism has given us. Libertarians, you could say, well, they're the closest, this would be the one thing that of course they like it. It's like, no, because actually there's still a lot of state control going on, so no one's got what they want. And the point there is that acceleration is basically it's in the name, philosophically speaking, comes from originally Nietzsche in The Will to Power, where he says that the leveling of European man needs to be accelerated. And then specifically Deleuze and Guattari take this on in Anti-Oedipus near the end of the book and say that we need to accelerate the process. So, and the process of capitalism is, as I've said, this positive oriented thing where basically anything which is subsumed into its mechanics, it either uses to become more profitable or grow bigger or faster or more efficient, or it simply will just ignore it. So people could say, well, hang on, we could ignore capital. There is ways to be non-capitalist in Western society or in society general. Okay, I'd say, okay, well, give me some examples. And one of the clear ones is, well, what about if you become sort of a primitivist, you go into the woods and you do that, and it's okay. Okay, let's think about that for a second. Firstly, you're talking about land, and that's basically been capitalized. So you need to purchase the land. You've already got to take up a contract with capitalism in doing that. You need to probably pay taxes and maintenance on the land, so you're already within it there. But in terms of not feeding the beast, okay, you can not feed the beast, but what happens when you don't feed the beast and you don't partake? You simply stagnate and you suffocate, and you'll just be alienated. You won't really be allowed into its systems at all. And then there's also the conceptual, sort of more metaphysical argument there, which I take from Michel Serres, that says, well, actually, what Marx calls the alien force has actually possessed us. So if we were to say, you know what, I want some time out, I'm going to the forest, our brains are still economizing in the way of capitalist thought. And much of the way that we appropriate virtualities of objects, such as trees and land, we would think of in a manner which capitalism has taught us.
To say take time out, you've fucked yourself there, because you're already framing it as like, well, I'm taking it's effectively time away from of reality, even though that's an impossibility. So it's. You know what it reminds me of? Because it's funny. Maybe it was a show with Matt, but I think Matt articulated that it's not that it's sort of like postmodernism. It's not that people are accelerationists. It's that accelerationism is happening now. It's not a thing you choose. It reminds me of, remember the Scottish comedian Kevin Bridges in his breakout performance, he was talking about what happened to kids in high school when their parents were away in Scotland, and he said, oh, they're having a party, but it wasn't that you were having a party, you were getting a party. And acceleration is sort of, it's a way of seeing that no one, I mean, yes, you can kind of accelerate things, but it's more for me anyway, it's a useful framework of coming back to what we were saying, like, did something go wrong, or is this just what happens now? Because you can kind of paradigm up and see the whole moment. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no. I definitely agree. And this is why I said at the start, like, it's really like a really squeaky thing to talk about in a way. It's like I have to tread so carefully, because I would be doing it a disservice to say that the current iterations of what many people culturally and communally and societally consider accelerationism to be, which in the media is a white supremacist movement, that is part of the process, but I have to emphasize it's part of the process, but it isn't the process itself. So what comes from it? These are symptoms, and it's like we early accelerationist thought was left accelerationism, which is like accelerate the techno-economic faculties of capitalism so that it can create UBIs and automation and emancipate people in a Marxist manner. And for a long time, that is how accelerationism was understood, as actually a very, very leftist movement, even a Marxist movement. And but you've got to understand that iteration of it was just part of the underlying process of what the hell is happening. As you say, we've got this now. And so when people say, is it a white supremacist movement? It's like, that's symptomatically what it's become very momentarily, but that isn't it in itself. And it will transform into many things. And what's interesting is to look at the process and say, how did we sort of move from left accelerationism to actually quite a reactionary accelerationism, and then to an unconditional one, and then we moved out to this other thing, and I'm trying to think. I mean, there's a few relatively new accelerationist texts going on where it's like gender accelerationism. How do we move? What's going on with this process to transform this thing? But it really at heart, it's like, it's an acceptance of this is what we've got, what can we do with it, and how do we anchor ourselves within that in a certain way. And I think that one of the points is that if at any point you're like, right, this is what this is, and you draw a box around it and you put your feet down, it's just going to move on without you, which is sort of the same thing as you were talking about earlier about critiquing the spectrum. It's one of the problems with the spectrum is people forget that on an intersubjective level and a personal level and a communal level, the spectrum of politics, if such a thing exists, is always moving. Yeah. So if you put your feet down and say, right, these are my positions, it's like, okay, then well, they might last a week, but in a few months' time, at the rate we're moving, let alone a few years, you're going to be somewhere you don't even realize you are. And obviously this happened to a lot of conservatives now who are realizing that the positions that they held 10, 20 years ago now put them in the camp of extreme right wing. And, it's, as you actually mentioned, Robert Anton Wilson earlier, and it's him who said that a conservative, in 20 years, a conservative becomes a liberal who stands still becomes a conservative after 20 years, right? Because they have to keep up with that. But accelerationism can be very simple or very, very annoyingly complicated. And but I think you're right. The money, it's what we've got. This is how things are now. And it's an acceptance of capitalism.
There are parts of it. So the John Cousins episode I really enjoyed, because I think one of the things, particularly when it comes to Mark Fisher, and this is tragic as someone who, has battled depression quite a bit, I do think there's a case where if you make capital this kind of multi-dimensional matrix villain that can travel back in time and be all this kind of stuff. What he was sort of doing there was expressing his depression into the cosmos, right, and describing that as capital, because one of the valid critiques, I think, of shittier left discourse is things that people don't like are capitalist. But that being said, just coming back to Bob Wilson's point, even if it's not true, it is a transformative exercise to go with, to kind of take as true, so that a liberal who stands still becomes a conservative after 20 years. If we layer into that the kind of endless return moment, where I think of it this way, I think of a shrinking historical memory. So capitalism has basically gaslit people into not being able to access history in a valid way, in like an authentic way. So that this is, when you look at people, not just toppling statues, valid statues of slave owners, but the whole thing where they just started toppling statues of, it was basically going to be Harriet Tubman, the next thing, right? And it was this just complete. And then when black people would try to stop younger black kids from tearing down statues that were, from anti-slavery movements, they get these vicious intergenerational arguments. And what I can see there is the kind of there's an accelerationist read on that, which is the inability to get at the past and its endless return, or its ersatz return as a simulacra. And so I want to layer that over to a liberal who stands still as conservative. At the moment, they also think they're like radical Marxists. So it's this ultimate, this is what I mean by, even if it's not true that capital can be this dangerous multi-dimensional archon, rearranging things, it's worth thinking with or sitting with that as a possibility, because you suddenly get to see it is protecting itself again by so that the liberals don't realize, oh goodness, I've become a conservative. You can kind of layer over the top with the same behaviors, this idea that they're radical leftists, but at the same time unbelievably anti-joy and anti-life and anti-sex and all these like literally conservative things. And this is kind of why I wanted to have the opening topic area to be accelerationism, because it gives you you can sit in it and it's a perspective, right? And it's a perspective that allows you to go, oh, cool, all right, this is sort of not like where I'm at in a fixed way, but I can break out of the momentum of it enough that I can see that there is momentum. Does that track?
Yeah, because when you're in it, it's sort of like the frog being boiled in the pot in a way. You know, if you drop a frog into boiling water, it's going to jump straight out. But if you slowly boil it and the contradictions and hypocrisies, I mean, you know, famously Deleuze and Guattari state nothing ever died of contradictions, which I think is where we're at. If you're boiled in hypocrisy and contradictions and should we say corruption for so long, which starts very minorly, eventually you're just not even going to notice what's going on. And me and Matt were talking about this recently, that when you take a step back and you begin to have a relationship with capitalism and society and modernity in which it's sort of reciprocal, you go in for a bit, you go, what's going on? And then you have to take these momentary steps out to go, okay, I'm going to look at this, I'm going to try and look at this from from what Marxists would call the wilderness, or just from a detached position. And you go, oh, that's what's going on now. And now I can sort of enter it again with a new frame of mind. And it's interesting, you mentioned the statue toppling, because it's probably quite a controversial thing to say, and many of my friends will be like, what are you on about? But I think on a very large level, I didn't see too much there that was actually political. What I saw was a rebellion against what I was talking about earlier, a rebellion against the recycling of the future. Like, people, I think coronavirus almost like capture, you know, the mandatory having to stay in for a very, very extroverted society, and for a society which finds in extroversion a virtue. You know, it's good to be this outgoing, very like, I'm doing this, I'm doing that person. That is seen as a virtue by modernity. When this is sort of pressured down, I think this was just an absolute sort of explosion moment where I personally don't think it had to be any certain thing which would have caused this. It could have been anything. And it seemed that much of the statue toppling, the riots, were just like, we don't even know what to do. And that was an accelerationism almost of the self, like, I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to go explode. Because what else can you do? Because we've you know, this is the really interesting problem that I find with accelerationism, which is the problem of limits. It's like we've just keep reaching the same limit over and over again with regard to what we produce culturally, with regard to what we produce mentally, or how we think these ideas. We're still on the same spectrum. Like, I'm fairly critical of current, like, the idea of all these new genders, because I think you're still working within the same ideas. And it's this problem of, if you know what's on the other side of a limit, then it's not a limit at all. If you know what's in the frontier, or over the frontier, or over the horizon, it's not a horizon at all, because you've already conceptually understood it. And we just keep reaching this point where it's like anything that we want to produce or recreate is just a form of aesthetic recycling, and we're caught in a loop where we don't, you know, how can we bring the new in again? You know, everything is just the same and same again. So it's like these riots are just an explosion, but they haven't solved anything, because it's like we've brought the same thing back around again. And this is why it's like, well, okay, we need to push, we need to accelerate. And I think this this can be applied to sort of all things. When you realize why things change, it usually is because they reach this point where they can't contain the constant spinning of the same over and over again. It reaches a point where it just has to break. But what causes that, of course, is a big question, which I I think consistently fail to answer.
Well, that's really well described, and I think one of the reasons why, maybe not you personally, but I think one of the reasons why out of broadly left thinking, it is like there is that failure, is the sort of shitty underlying metaphysics of the whole project, right? I think, you speak about like Deleuze and Guattari, but the story of everyone from Marx is essentially rebuilding this kind of ersatz metaphysics, because he made the idiotic mistake of considering his modified Hegelianism to be scientific, right? And this is the sort of infinite loop of something like progressivism, where they can't get behind the idea that expertisism is a premise, because they've arrived at that from like a expertisist perspective. And I think that's the trouble, where you can't actually get down into there are better ways of saying things that like material conditions from a magical or metaphysical perspective, but particularly I prefer magical rather than metaphysical. And that's kind of what Connor and I talk about twice a year, is what sort of fractal flowers emerge from a magical universe that would look left. So especially at the moment, for instance, talking about how things change and protect themselves and shift over time, and that's kind of part of the process. Like socialism means something very different wherever you catch it in the last few centuries, and at the moment it's kind of gone back to its weirdly earlier form, like of a non-specific interventionist do-goodery, and that appears to be what socialism is. But it's like, and so when you're looking at the critiques of socialism, everyone who's critiquing it is, you're dealing with people who've experienced the Cold War, and they're like, well, in fact, socialism is this very specific thing. And that was true. But it was also true that it was a non-specific interventionist do-goodery at some point as well. So you kind of, if I could kind of shake out, and the identitarian stuff's a good example, right? If you could reformulate, or if your expression of things like gender and sex and all the rest of it emerge out of a magical universe, they have an authenticity and essentialism in a way, but not in the way that, well, maybe in a way that can be critiqued as essentialism used to be. But it's kind of funny. Like I see all these ideas that if they were, it's almost like they're hydroponically grown rather than grown in the soil. And that's the bit that I think would help break it out. Because for instance, like, what do you do with this moment? Well, from a magical perspective, like, this is just what happens now. And that is literally in the stars, right? So astrology gives us a framework that this is what happens now. And so it's like accelerationism is a sort of parallel thought experiment to the idea that history reaches moments like this. Do you know what I mean? Everyone's downstream from Hegel. You can pretend you're not, but everyone's downstream from Hegel one way or the other. And it's almost like there's I don't know how you put those two things in dialogue, because astrology is a thing that happens now as well, right? So you end up with accelerationism and astrology eating itself, but they're both saying the same thing, which is, this is what's happened now. And so reconsider solutionism or interventionism, because that's part of what happens now. Does that track? Do you know what I mean? I think that's what I mean. I think my macro concern with left projects and left critiques is that they emerge, hearts in the right place, out of a really shitty metaphysics, right? So dialectical materialism and all the rest of it is trash. And if people don't get down there and go, okay, well then how do I think history works? Like what do I think the universe is made of? Then you end up with a lot of the idiocy that I think it is inevitable from that point, if your foundational metaphysics are trash, that you end up with where we are now, with what Matt Taibbi called the sort of Twitter Robespierres, who think they're radical leftists working for social media companies that have DARPA funding. Like, it's crazy, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you say about this idea of like nobody knowing what everyone's talking about. A different socialism, right? Or everyone's talking about different communism would be the same thing, because there's always that joke of like when leftists get in a debate and they go, so have you read Marx? Yeah, I've read Marx. Have you read Lenin? Oh, yeah, I've read Lenin. Have you read Stalin? Have you read Kropotkin? Have you read, and they'll always list until the point where you go, oh no, I haven't read them. You go, you don't know then. There's always always someone who like you could, it's such a specific, like, and then they'll go, oh, you have read Trotsky. Have you read this work by Trotsky though? And then it's their interpretations. It's quite difficult. But the point I would make on that is actually, I think the same thing's happening with the right, which doesn't make any sense to me, because in terms of ethics, morality, and what is socially sort of, let's say, acceptable and tolerated, with the right, those things should be unchanging. That's its point in a way, and I think they've become beholden to the same idea of leftism in a way that you can all have your personal form of communal politics, which doesn't work. And of course, there is sort of an individual aspect to the right, and there always has been. But I think it seems that they've sort of gone the same way, and you hear a lot of terms thrown around, which I think, man, you guys are really starting to fragment just as much as the left, classically liberal, classically conservative, paleo,
absolutely. But again,
it's on and on and on, and
because this is what happens now, right? So just going back to the socialist thing, if you look at this moment, and so I'm a big fan of a guy called Martin Armstrong, who's a trader, and he invented this AI, and really, really interesting guy. But he like literally knew Friedman. They were friends. So you can see he was friends with Maggie Thatcher. So when he says this is a social, what's going on at the moment, the kind of re-engineering of the Western economy, the Great Reset, he describes it as socialist. And the thing is, from a Friedman-esque perspective, it is, because it's the prevention of kind of like Adam Smith economic agents doing small business and all the rest of it, and money coming from the state. But similarly, it is a hyper-capitalist moment, and it's the same moment, because you look at it and go, this, like what Jim Cramer said in March after the CARES Act, and this is true, I've run the numbers, it is the greatest upward transfer of wealth in the history of mankind, and those fucking progressive senators voted for it and then toddled off to the Bronx wearing masks to hand out food at a soup kitchen. And I can't think of anything more accelerationist than that, but the point I was trying to make is that everyone is fondling the same hyperdimensional elephant, and it looks like your worst nightmare. And if your worst nightmare is socialism, that's what you see happening at the moment. And if your worst nightmare is this kind of hyper-capitalist, free-range totalitarian digital empire, same thing. And that just seems to be what it's that classic, this is what happens now. And something like accelerationism can allow you to look up and go, well, yeah, because just like the fragmentation of the left and the fragmentation of the right, part of this process is a complete incoherence in names and fixity. What do you think to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was wondering there for a while if we were talking about the same thing, but we that's outlined that we definitely are, and I was going to frame it in a different way. There's two pieces I would point people towards for this, which would both be by Nick Land. One would be the Atomization Trap, and one be a piece called Dispersion, which writes on the idea of any sort of unification requires an excess of energy to maintain it, which needs to be found in some sense. But the big problem here is on a non-occult level, but because I don't think it's actually that occult, really, it's not that hidden anymore. The idea of atomization, the idea of, I wrote a critique of, just a Twitter critique actually, last year, of the current gender politics, the idea of like this constant sort of perpetual fragmentation where any minor alteration to oneself, it suddenly becomes a new, form of sexuality, or something they ascribe to themselves. And I just saw that as capitalist, because it's just an increased form of atomization of from which you are far easier to sell and to mold. And what, the funny thing for me that always is that Deleuze-Guattari, Michel Foucault, Derrida, the conclusions that have been drawn from these in terms of emancipatory and let's say liberatory politics, in terms of sexuality, in terms of political and social freedoms, I think is actually the antithesis of what they are, of what the points they're trying to make is. Deleuze and Guattari talk about sort of becoming woman, becoming man, becoming whatever sexuality. That, for me, never read as there's a huge difference between becoming and become, and for them, I think it would be actually abhorrent that people are boxing themselves off in more minute and smaller and more micro boxes, because you just become a more coherent atom to be pulled by some random process. And there's this problem of like, why are you could redefine the problem which Wilhelm Reich Michel Foucault cites Wilhelm Reich at the start of Anti-Oedipus, and as that book is answering one question: why do we all desire to dominate ourselves? Why have we got this internal fascist who wishes to say, I am this, I am that? And this is the same thing that's going on within atomization, is why do we have this overarching, almost transcendental desire to separate ourselves and detach ourselves and atomize ourselves in such a way that we have to be distinct from other people? People take that as the problem there is that the alternative to that is you have to be part of community. And the point they're outlining in both of them is you don't have to enter into that debate at all. And what, when we talk, you spoke about the occult elephant in the room, and it seems that we're beholden to a negative which is reliant on our understanding of ourselves as an atom in the world.
Absolutely.
So what I mean by that is we've absolutely atomized ourselves, and we increasingly want to do so as like a proof we exist, almost like a constant perpetual game of a cultist peekaboo, like I am here, I exist, I'm now this, I'm now this, I'm now this. You can't stand still, because if you stand still, you get lost. And in relation to the negative, it's always a negative. So it's like, I am this in relation to that which is my alternative. So like you were saying, if you're a primitive and your worst nightmare is capitalism, you can very easily see that. If you're a capitalist and your worst nightmare is socialism, you can very easily see that and find somewhere in the world to do that. If you're X, Y, or Z, you can find your, let's say, A, X, Y, or Z, if you wish to look. And capitalism wants this, because in that sort of recursive loop between the positive and the negative is the point when you're very, very easy to be controlled. What it doesn't want you to do is to step outside of that loop and actually cultivate an existence which has a disdain for these loops generally.
Couldn't agree more. And it's funny because if people react negatively to the idea of like, well, what do we do if not atomize? Because like inside the loop as well is the counter to that the blob, and you go, well, no. And this comes back to why I think atomism works better as a soil from which to grow from, because you have relationality. This is kind of where there's an animist essentialism that doesn't fall into these loops, and it's it's outside of this kind of atomization, which is capital protecting itself. Like that, I quoted from the Fisher's Vampire's Castle piece in a recent blog post, and I forgot that he wrote it that way, but it's fucking perfect. That all of these discussions around gender and race are explicitly they ring fence a kind of bougie liberal conceptualization of what these are, and anything outside of that is an attack, and that is literally capital defending itself, and that's what's happening now.
Yeah, and this is the thing that people don't get, is when I say, and when accelerationists say everything is subsumed by capital, they mean it. And I think people, the entire idea of what emancipation is, you are filtering through this a capitalist economizing brain. So what you're dealing with is probably not what you think you're dealing with. And capitalism, of course, wants to give you these things, which are very, very much yours, but actually no one realizes that they're becoming beholden if they're left, right, center, whatever what they're really becoming beholden to is a transcendental form of atomization or individualism. It's always my socialism, or it's always my well, I'm a paleo-conservative, but I just, I have to tweak it so it's, whatever. And this is sort of, when people ask me what I am politically, I say, well, I'm not left. And really what I say now is I veer closest to Ernst Junger's concept of the anarch. Like I just want to have it's almost like I just want to have a conversation with politics all the time, say. So it's like actually the accelerationist perspective. It's like how I watch TV. It's super, super pretentious, and I know that, but I'm no longer watching the program for what it is. I sort of watch a lot of stuff which, happens to be on or whatever. I don't sit down and watch TV at all, really. But if it happens to be on around family or friends, I watch it with this air of, why is this being made? What's going on there? Why do people want to see this? And I think that's the same thing with politics is, why is that working? I wonder what direction that's going to go. What else can you do? Otherwise, you're just getting subsumed in something. And I understand that you can always argue this idea that, well, that's another way of... But I think it's the one exit from capitalism.
I agree. It's funny, the left thing, because it's if you try to find where you are, it's like a model UN, which is why I can't it's like, I'm an ANCOM, I'm a Maoist, and it's I hear them all in Ralph Wiggum voices, finding where they are on it. So you go, you know what, fuck you guys then. And the trouble is, you go, cool, then I'm post left, and then you actually work out who the post left thinkers are, and I'm like, not like you guys. The post left that went like full Nazi, and you think, hang on a minute, what? And this is why Junger's anarch, we'll get people to explain that in a second, but
actually,
we'll get people to go on. There's
one thing I just want to comment on, though, that there's a reason Deleuze and Guattari were so on the money in the 70s with calling their 2-volume work Anti-Oedipus and The Thousand Plateaus. The 2 volumes are collectively called Capitalism and Schizophrenia, which basically market the same thing. We're talking about schizophrenia here, not clinical schizophrenia, though it does derive many of the ideas from it. And the overarching idea of schizophrenia is an adherence, like an inability to adhere to a consistent identity, like you're always fluxing. And that is something that capitalism absolutely loves, because there's that brilliant cartoon, and I reference it all the time, though I really need to find it, but it's basically that American Gothic painting, but it's just drawn as a cartoon, and above it it says capitalism's worst nightmare, and one of them is just saying to the other, we've got everything we have and we're completely content in life, right? And that's the problem of an identity. Capitalism understands that if you go, right, actually I'm fine doing this, guess what? There's a limit to your purchases now. There's a limit to movement, and capitalism is fluid, so it needs to make it so you no longer want to adhere to an identity, and you adhere to this idea that you have to keep up, and that's schizophrenic.
So you said a couple of things that was a good thing to drop in there. I think you're right. There's a couple of things we said there, and it's sort of the question and the answer kind of interlock, because usually if the first time people encounter this kind of material, it's like, then okay, what do we do? And you go, see, that's it, like this is what I tried to do with the most recent blog post. You go, how do you solve for solutionism? But there's a couple of things. You use the word exit very specifically, and you mentioned Junger's anarch. So for people who are unaware, like maybe start with the anarch, and then, or actually you can start with wherever you want. You want to start, exit means something specific in this case, and whether or not it's possible, and then anarch.
Yeah, I mean, exit's a tough one. I think I'll do it the other way around, if that's okay, because I think it's a bit easier. So Ernst Junger, who was doesn't help my white supremacist thing with accelerationism. Ernst Junger was, by all technical standards, a member of the Nazi Party, but he was not a Nazi. He wrote one of the first anti-Nazi books called On the Marble Cliffs, which Hitler even knew was against him very cryptically. And Junger never really belonged to anyone. He was a and probably one of the most interesting figures who ever lived. And he lived an extremely long life and was never really beholden to any movement at all, which is evident from his book Oimishville, which I recently did spell Eumiswil. I recently did an interview about this with Russell Berman, and in this book it's where he first conceptualizes the idea of the anarch as opposed to the anarchist, and it does need to be stressed that there's a difference. So the anarchist, as we commonly know it, with the ist and the ism, sees what's going on in the world, has their thoughts, thinks their thoughts, has their ideas, and then they go out, they try to change it, and they put down a flag, put down a boot, and they get involved and they get caught up in that flow. The anarch is the sovereign unto themselves, who sees what's going on in the world, thinks their thoughts, maintains that relation, but makes no mistakes about the part they play in that, and they have a detachment, they have a retreat. And this is what happens in Oimishville. Is the protagonist, Velator, sees that civilization is going to collapse. So he believes it's going to collapse, and he exits to the woods. And he still maintains this relationship with he does understand that you can't just leave, you can't just fully exit. And it was interesting. I had a conversation about this recently with Matt Cahoon about this idea of Henry Thoreau and Walden. And everyone makes this mistake of saying it was Thoreau's project was a failure of him going to the pond at Walden, because he still had meals went back and had meals with his mother, and people would walk past him in the lake and say hi, and etc., etc. And he was only like a couple of miles from his home. But I think actually that's more of a success of exit, because he understood that he was writing about how to find that vision with modernity. And I was saying to Matt, a reason a lot of nature writing like Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire, Aldo Leopold's stuff falls flat for me, is because there's a complete absolute detachment where they almost act as if modernity no longer exists where they are. And I think that's actually more dangerous. And I think Thoreau is right in saying, not how do we just exit and leave it behind, but how do we exit with the knowledge we have of that thing we've left behind. And you need to maintain that relationship if you want to. Exit is a process, and exiting from modernity and exiting from society in a way is a process of keeping up that relationship. And the anarch is the way to do that, in that you're not beholden to an ism. You simply view them as like, what's this function doing? What's going on here? And accelerationism is all those processes. And so you're almost like, with accelerationism, you're keeping an eye on the macro process. You're saying, well, how come communism's making a comeback? Or how come Satanism's coming in now? You're not getting drawn into them, in like a, like an almost like a, I made the joke of like, capitalism at the moment, for many people who try to keep up with politics, is much like those episodes of Ed, Edd and Eddy, where they tried to keep up with the trend, but they never could. They were always one step behind, and it was like this overwhelming desire to just like, I wish I could just, but you're never going to, because there's always going to be one step ahead of you. That's the entire point of Heraclitean philosophy, which underpins accelerationism, in my opinion, is there's no point when you can stand in the river and it's going to stop for you. So you can't keep up. Either you lay down and you go with the flow, either you stop, in which case it's going to batter you, or you do what the anarch does. You step onto the riverbank and you can walk at your own pace, but you never keep your eye off the river. That's what I'd say.
I see the Heraclitus, I see the pre-Socratics, anything flow model, I'm a fan of. That obviously animism, right? And it's interesting, you use modernity there a couple of times, and part of I think you're right about Thoreau. What I think he didn't get right, and modernity is like the moderns word for civilization, but it's the other trouble with using left and post-structuralist framing is that it's all European, right? So there's the very idea of nature and culture being separate, and even European attempts like Latour's nature culture don't necessarily work. And it gets back to that foundational metaphysics problem of modernity is a description of the speed at which several centuries of European civilizations or cultures developed in technological complexity, right? And it's sort of interesting because I think in general, and particularly for anarchism, but left thinking emerged as a set of policy alternatives to very specific form of power, which is a European monarchy, right? And I think one of the reasons that it's so either disastrously or unevenly stepped outside the Eurosphere is because there's no such thing as religion in the Amazon as something that is separate to science and politics and all the rest of it. We've split these up because of the historical processes that formulated Europe, right? So part of my exit is to realize that you can't exit from modernity, but I can put it in a little box, right? I can put it in a little box with all these other kind of silly ideas like Swiss clocks and whatever, and this is a kind of how you can enter the jungle without living in the jungle, is to realize that part of the trap is how we describe these things, and you can't get away from them. But you can to some extent put them in a box, which is my separate. That's a sort of version of the river metaphor, right? But in very specific, malicious thought forms that you think, God, what do I do about this? And like, put it in a box. And I think that because it comes back to how do you solve for solutionism, right? And I think part of that, an eternal exit. Do you know what I mean? Rather than an incomplete exit, like the actual door out lasts as long as your life. What do you think?
The box is and just saying, well, that's in that room, that's in that drawer, forget about that, is dangerous. And I think people need to have almost the audacity, in a way, to put modernity in a box and say, I'm going to look at you from time to time and just see what's going on. So I make sure that nothing's going to explode in the box and destroy what I've developed. You need to make sure that modernity isn't doing something like that. And this was the problem. I've got an episode coming up on Ted Kaczynski and the Unabomber, and I think he's such a fantastic example of this, because he's an example of someone whose mind was attached to this idea of an absolute exit, and that such a thing could ever be achieved, So he exits to the wood and lives in his shack, and it's actually fine for a few years. And the only reason he starts doing these terrorist attacks is because there's planes flying overhead, there's dirt bikes driving past, and there's a logging company, I think, within a sort of 20-mile radius. And it's like, well, you have to keep up. You can't, you think you found Eden, you need to maintain Eden, and you need to maintain exit. And I think to a certain extent, you can't. Modernity exists, and any idea that you're going to have a complete absolute exit is a wrong dream to have. It's a very dangerous dream, actually, and it's basically, that's a utopian dream, I would argue. And that, and what happens when you do that and you go, right, this is absolutely perfect, is you go mad when there's a tiniest, almost like a modernity OCD, right? You've got your Eden, but then modernity, flies a plane overhead, so it's like it's a tiny bit of dirt that you have to, and you're compulsive. Whereas I think you need to sit back and say that these things are going to happen, these processes are going to happen, and that's the accelerationist point. Is, I think, not so much letting them happen, but knowing that they are going to happen, and attuning your way of life to a point where they're not going to affect you adversely,
Yeah, I like it. I like the idea of the OCD thing too, because it's always struck me as a hatred and whatever. You can use a Freudian term for it or whatever, but I don't think they actually like humans. I think they're squeamish around crowds. I think they're squeamish around human smells and sounds, and it's almost like something happened to them in their early childhood to make them seek for this dangerous idea of the pristine, like this sort of Edenic journey, which was politically dangerous. The idea of nature being pristine underpins European legal claims on most of the world, right? Like, well, no one's here and no one's using it. It's pristine nature rather than it being what it is. And it's funny, they're looking for a very dangerous thing, and if they don't find it, start bombing stuff, whatever. That's I saw you tweet about that. So I haven't actually, this is a weird way of saying it, I have not read the Unabomber's material, but apparently it's good. Did I put it on the list? No?
Oh, yeah, 100% put it on the list. People, what I would say is, it's just one of those things where I feel like I shouldn't have to say. It's like I obviously don't agree with his murders, even though by his own logic they are actually logically sound, because he understands that people believe that modernity has rid us of all violence, but actually the violence that is inherent within nature, by Ted's logic this is, has basically been subsumed into the system. So the violence that was once in nature, you find that within modernity and within technology. But people forget that Ted was actually like a maths prodigy, stupidly bright, and a very, very smart person, and was also probably almost definitely actually part of MK Ultra. So yeah, and then they haven't shied away from this in the quite a few now documentaries that have been on him. And actually that's the great irony of Ted, is that the more he pushed against this, and now he's an absolute sort of node of modernity, in that there's all these documentaries and all this. So yeah, and I think, you know, the recent second edition published of his second book. But yeah, definitely read it.
Nice one. All right. What else? Do we want to talk more about Omiswell, or I think we kind of covered it with the Anarch? It's another one to recommend.
Yeah, it's a good place. I think with Junger, though, I'd start with that. There's so many angles with Junger, but I would start with Storm of Steel and then move. Omisville will be very difficult to find. It's like out of print, which is really frustrating. Yeah, but I'm thinking of other stuff we could touch on, and I do want to touch on like what you think of contemporary occultism in general. I know that's a huge question, because for me, it's just such a difficult question. It's very difficult to sort of define the conversation whilst you're in it, right? So it's like a lot of people have this argument that we can't define what's what both world wars, which you can sort of subsume into one war, actually had as an effect on the world, because actually we're still in it, and it will be another sort of 40 years till we can actually finally step back, draw a line around that era and go, wow, that's what that did, right? And I wonder, you know, this is one thing I really like about Junger, is he was very good. There's a few people I could name who are great at spotting things while they're within it. Ballard was one. He had his finger on the pulse and still does, even though he's dead. Junger is another, and John Michael Greer, I find the three thinkers who I think who have, let's, you know, use the idea that we've brought in, who have exited enough to be able to look from a third point of view and look in. So, you know, maybe you could try that, and, you know, what do you think? A huge question. What do you think the contemporary state of occultism is?
I tend to put things in longer historical timelines, right? So there's probably, and first of all, I'm a magician. You kind of mentioned it earlier. I don't say occultism or occultist because it's not hidden. If I had business cards, it'd be on the business card, and it's one of those kind of important defining things. I was on Magical Egypt. Well, it's not out yet, but the next series of Magical Egypt, and they're like, so what do we call you? And I'm like, I do magic. Like, I'm here for that reason. And one of the things about this moment, dominated witchcraft or whatever, is that has an ontological validity in some people's eyes, right? I think that's one of the things. So contemporary occultism is in many respects the same as the last few centuries of kind of like public occultism and New Age. Like, most of it's very disappointing. Some of it isn't, but like, when you think, you know, what point do you want to go back to where you go, well, most of them weren't that good. Most of the people in the Golden Dawn weren't that good, right? And most of their reads on the world is sort of like, what do you want occultism or magic to do, right? Do you want it to have good internal discourse? Do you want it to have a good critique on the world? I don't think, at the moment, no one has good internal discourse. Like, it's rubbish because people spend too much time on Facebook and not enough time doing magic or whatever, right? So it's not in a good state, but I don't think that's a differentiator. Parts of it I think are really good. I think in the corners that I run in, we're a bit further ahead than other people in working out what post-digital interaction looks like, which is actually kind of a thing I was about in my career when I had one. So that's probably a part of it. So everyone's using Zoom rooms and so on, but the sort of communities I'm involved in are making sure that the kind of 90s chaos magic promise that we're all going to have, like, dial in and have these kind of second life utopias is shite. And like it's military technology. It always was. I believed it for a decade. Most of us did. Most of us had some 1998, not even to 2008, maybe like 95 to the dot-com crash. I don't know, but there was a brief few moments of dial-up there where you thought this is going to be the future, not just magic, but everything. Information superhighway, lawnmower man, whatever. Bring it on. And that turned out to not be the case because it's like a military technology and mind control platform. But it's also nevertheless the way most people have ersatz interactions with other humans, especially at the moment. So it's a question of what can we get past the ersatz to some form of authenticity. And the obvious example, it was before freedom of assembly was destroyed. The obvious example was to use it as a communication and networking platform and then actually meet in person. And people who can do that still do that. But I think it's the next thing to happen for the world of magic needs to be, as it is for everything else, to kind of grapple with this moment, and in particular the next sort of 3 to 5 years. And I don't, it has all the same problems we were just talking about, like the statues thing and the historical amnesia. And so as a result, there's a sort of weird truncation of plagiarism. So people are thinking that either they've come up with ideas or have it's not even like stealing ideas. There's an inability to have a coherent historical narrative of what the last 120 years have been, and that's not like magic or occultism specific, right? So that's the state of it at the moment. On the one hand, there are some, there has been over the last 15 years glorious new books and new modes of thought and new discussions. And in that sense, there was like a late 19th century occult moment. But that is typically defined by how it bleeds out into macro culture, right? So, and that certainly happened in the last since like 2015 in particular, with the kind of Brooklyn Wiccans against Trump and all with their Urban Outfitters candles and things, to where we are now. But it's kind of, and I gave a presentation, I think it was beginning of last year in Brisbane, about the devil. And at the time I said, it's probably easier to list the shows on Netflix that aren't about the devil than are, right? And so when I look at the state of something like magic, I look at it in that, because of my dinner party guests, in the sense of, well, what's actually going on in the imaginal that's expressing in the waking world? Because it's almost like what happens inside magic is the tip of that iceberg. And the rest of the iceberg is that erupts in elsewhere in nature culture. So I'm neither bullish nor bearish, I guess, about occultism or magic, because this is just what happens now. Do you know what I mean? That's where I'm at.
I think one question I would ask there is, I've noticed this as well, especially a lot of new Netflix, especially animated shows I've noticed, but there is quite a few other occultist ones. And it was one of my predictions from 2018, I believe, that there would be a rise in quite ironically, alternative spiritual movements, because people are really grasping for some meaning once again, but they still want it to be this atomized, like, own individual thing. They don't want to have this reversion. But we are finally seeing a reversion. A lot of people are going back to Christianity, as far as I can see, and a lot of people are going back to more traditional forms of worship, myself included, to be honest. But what do you make of this influx of Netflix animated shows and live action shows which have these? I personally think they're dangerous. I'll put that out there. I think they're clumsy, lazy in the way that they do it. But what do you think of this influx of sort of, let's just say,
give me some
occult
animated
shows?
examples.
Okay, so there's one recently which is quite popular, which was the premise of the show that it's the discussions of. This guy had a podcast and he has discussions.
The Duncan Trussell stuff.
Duncan Trussell stuff, and then I would also, like, not that I've watched lots of it, but I noticed it when I was in it. There's when I watched a few bits of it, like Adventure Time and even like Regular Show, and a lot of these kids shows seem to have odd hermetic themes. And there's one very, very recently, something hotel, Hazlitt Hotel, I think it's called, and I've watched like a few clips of it, and it's like very heavy on old Voodoo stuff, and I just think that it's callously placed.
Well, Funnily enough, I think my problem with that is the prevalence of animated programming. I'm leaving the Duncan Trussell thing as separate. Amongst adults as the further infantilism of people who still read young adult books in their early 30s and identify as upper class. So this comes back to an accelerationist read of Capital, and also the kind of infantilization is keeping your identities bougie and safe. So weirdly, when you say, what do you think of the animation stuff, my skin crawls at the idea of adults spending 8 hours, and I mean grown-ass adults. I don't mean like 18, 19. I mean 35-year-old grown-ass men watching a cartoon. And I think that, like, so it's not even, I don't have a magical take on that. This is a political take. So that's where I mean I haven't watched any of them because I am a grown ass man in my 30s, and I watched one episode of the Duncan thing. It just looked like a podcast to me, so I'm like, okay, cool. But I didn't watch any more of them, so I don't really have an opinion on that. But the others, I think it's more, again, this kind of endless return. The kind of Harry Potter thing itself was bald-faced plagiarism, but it's like, oh, that worked, so let's just iterate the shit out of versions of that. Do you know? I don't even really view it as magic's problem. I just think it's a thing that's happening right now.
Yeah, I remember saying to that someone when I was in college. They said, oh, have you read it? And I said, oh, I started reading one of the Harry Potter novels, but I thought it was the most unimaginative book I've ever read. And they said, what? It's full of imagination. I said, oh, actually, it's the antithesis of imagination, because it's the same ideas, but actually applied with less imagination, because, you know, it's like, and as soon as I said it to them, you can sort of see them realize, you know, I know this sounds quite arrogant, but it's like, you mean, you're telling me witches and wizards is imaginative? They went, oh yeah, I guess I see what you mean. It's like, it's been you know, we've done it. She just did it on a very young adult applicable scale, and that did sort of boom that whole market. And the infantilization, I'll just say it like that, of society is something that really, really interests me, actually. And it's another accelerationist thing. I think you should sit back and go, why is it that we have, I think that probably would make an amazing Jungian book with respect to this idea that Jung had of the reason you have a child is actually to have your childhood, because when you're a child, you know, you're in it, so you don't know it, and then when you have a child, you get to experience childhood as like, you know, it's happening. And I almost think that perhaps there's an argument there that there's I perhaps the statistics say otherwise, but it seems to me that in the West there is a decrease in the emphasis on the idea of having children, the idea of, you know, traditional family values and things along these lines. So, you know, what's being replaced now is, for me, a combination of, yes, this infantile consumerism, you know, this constant return and want to have things as they were, and holding on to that quite literally for dear life. And this in combination with what I call the Disneyfication of society, in which you have good and you have evil. There's no shadows anymore. The good people are absolutely 100% good, and they've never, ever, ever even looked at something bad. And the bad people are 100% bad, and there is absolutely no nuance. And as soon as the good people do a tiny bit of bad, they've always been bad, and they always were, and they are bad. You know, there's no place for, well, people have flaws anymore. There's no place for what Giordano Bruno would call the shadows. It's good and evil, and that's a very easy way to think. And it's a symptom of an infantile understanding of the world, of sides. Once again, you know, it's are you against Trump? Are you for Trump? You know, it's like, what is this, a Marvel movie? You know?
Yes. Well, no. It is in the sense that they're both mind control, but like the Jungian read on it, well, more specifically the synchromistic read, which is the application of depth psychology to culture, is a fear of the future. And that's actually how, I mean, I can think with the endless return and the amnesia and the nostalgia industry from an accelerationist perspective, but they're the same thing to me, which is creatives cannot look with bravery at 2030. No one can look forward because we know it's crap. So we're literally shrinking under the blanket and sucking our thumb again. And we're doing that culturally because this moment, one of the things that makes it so successful is that it has spent several years turning us back out of adulthood, and what we have at the moment, the challenges that we are facing, require adulthood, require adult thinking. And instead we've been, and you can consider it an op, you can do what I do, which is kind of get metaphorically Gnostic with it and say it doesn't matter how or why you think it happened. We were sent home from school to watch daytime TV this year, right? And that is part of this infantilizing, and we can't see past whatever the event horizon. I have a few suggestions astrologically as to when those exact dates are, but it's kind of irrelevant. The flow over the last decade has been an infantilizing one, and even more, last 20 years, but it accelerates in the last decade where all we do is Marvel movies, right? Like we literally can't make a new movie. Everything is back. Everything is, and this is why I find it so fascinating. We can't get history correct because we spend all our time looking in the past from under a blanket. And this is where we're at the moment. I find it why we need something like the exit, why we need to solve for solutionism is, it's not the post-war period. It's not put on your big boy britches and go and, I don't know, get a job at General Motors. That's not the moment, and that's not the solve, right? And I don't even like the word solve, because there were solves. This is because, this is how history works, right? There were solves in the post-war period. That was the solution, right? It's not now. The solution now is to realize there is no solution, but that shouldn't be bleak. You mentioned utopia being dangerous. It is, but that's why if I was to pick my political position, I've done this a bunch of times, I describe myself as a Le Guinist utopianist, because that's essentially a form of pacifist anarchism somewhere near anarch, right? But I use utopian deliberately because I'm like, well, it never happens. Let's just head in that direction. And that direction is through the exit. And I think we don't find it underneath the blankets watching cartoons in fear of the next few years. That's my thoughts.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say, I think we're both, accelerationism is clearly about a question of future and of time and what happens in time. And this idea of, I think there's a problem here with the Western-centric notion of free will. And we've had this like fetish of, we have free will, we have agency, we have complete agency of everything. I don't think that's correct. I have sort of my own conception of how we have free will, but it doesn't particularly matter. But this idea of the future, if your idea of the future is always going, or you are compelled towards a future which is this comfortable, infantile, under the blanket thing, then the future is never going to change. And I think this is, once again, that question of frontiers, is if you finally creep out from under that blanket and go, I'm going to be a big brave boy and turn off my nightlight, then the frontier finally actually becomes a true frontier, because you actually don't know what there's going to be, but you take a leap. And the problem is any truly innovative or different, let's say, leap, even like a leap of faith, the point of that is you can't have an evidential continuity to it. Like Kierkegaard, when he talks about Christianity, there is a gap. You have to take a leap of faith, and the point of faith is, I have no clue what's here. And I think the same thing has to happen with the future. We can't attend to the idea of agency, because that attends to this idea of the past, the present, and the future. And you go from the past to the present, and then the present goes to the future. The problem then is, of course, you're in the present, stuck under this blanket in this eternal present. You need to move away from that idea, strip off the blanket, have an exit, and go, right, this could all go tits up, this could break, this could make some things worse, this could make some things better, but we need to take an absolute leap of faith in terms of that idea of faith, of a faith in a potential nothingness, and into a true frontier, and we've lost these frontiers. We've lost all the frontiers. It's interesting you mentioned the internet, and I had an interview with Peter Ludlow, when I remember those days of the early internet, and it just seemed like this absolute Wild West. What the hell is going on? And that frontier got tamed by the atomization of capitalism coming in via the advent of Facebook in 2007 and 8. Yeah, Nick Land calls it the Facebook slump because all you did, you changed this extremely fragmentary, innovative, anonymous, and I think that's very important, the anonymity, because then you no longer have those true attachments to ego, and it basically just imported the real world in actually a worse form, because it basically meant you could change your real world image and make it seem better, and people then had to upkeep that, and that frontier got destroyed, and I think that frontier is coming back, but I think it'll take a lot of repairing. But this idea of frontiers, I think, is super important.
I think it is coming back. I think there's it's not a lost decade. A frontier needs frontiers people, and I think that's sort of what we and my group are trying to do in different ways, but they are everywhere. We need urgent ways of being sort of rhizomatically digitally connected that aren't using these sort of platforms. And that's not, and the trouble is, again, that gets back to the solutionist thing, which is like, well, tell me what platform to use. And I'm like, it's not like that. It's a model of connectivity that can use and drop platforms as needed. And so there are things like that I think will happen. Again, if you have to stand up. Funny enough, last week I read bits of one of William James's Harvard talks, and it's basically, he's talking about what the point of life is. And what you just said was very Joseph Campbell, very William James, very like, and James's point was, whatever the external conditions, that's kind of always the thing you need to do. Like if you go back 800 years, you need to take that moment. And I found a lot of value in thinking with that perspective, that yes, this is a singular event horizon style moment in the history of quote unquote Western civilization, the next decade, right? No question. But be that as it may, even if that wasn't happening, what you just kind of said about getting out from underneath the blanket would still hold. And that was William James's point. Whatever happens in the future and what have you, that kind of nightingale of eternal meaning sings in the heart of a human, right? And I took a lot of joy from that, because we do, again, it's part of the sort of explosion in the fireworks factory that is capitalism at this moment. We think we're reacting to this moment, and we are, but on another level, it's just the moment. Like this comes back to the magical perspective. It's just the moment. You're still, as far as I can tell, some sort of either a fragment of or the entire divine, and that holds true where and whenever you are, and that's one of the ways I think maybe people can get out from under said blanket.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's strange. I think we really are attending to the same conversation from two different perspectives, even though I am sympathetic to the occultist angle. But I think a fragment of the divine is one can, in seeing themselves as a fragment of the divine, adhere to this pessimistic view that they are never going to be able to attend to the true absolute unification of the divine, that they're never going to live up to that. And I think there's something to be said in relation to accelerationism with respect to that, of you are a fragment of the immanent divine of accelerationism. And Deleuze and Guattari actually do state at a certain point that immanent capitalism is divine. So it's quite ironic that you state that. And, there's obviously the famous book by Joshua Ramey about the Hermetic Deleuze. So I don't really think we're too far apart at all here. In fact, I think we're on about the same thing. And the fragment of the divine, or the fragment or a cog of accelerationism, that can seem pessimistic. But once you are no longer beholden to the process which has sort of been given to you, and you step back and actually look at your position as a fragment or as a cog, that's when it starts to get interesting. You begin to spot the communications, you begin to spot the connections, instead of simply just working with them in that infantile manner of like, right, get under the blanket and I'll just do what's expected of me. It's like, step out and go, wow, this is huge. Let's just almost like the meaning is to view the entire thing, which is a very sort of Alan Watts perspective. But
yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, sorry.
It is. It reminds me, we are talking about the same thing. And I went looking in William James for a solve for some really deep despair with this moment. And I'm usually pretty good with this stuff, managing it with usual things, diet and regular exercise and psychedelics and all these things, which were taken away from me by circumstance the last couple of months. So it felt like, holistically managing depression is sort of like a plane with multiple engines, and they all started like one after the other started failing. I'm like, this isn't good. So I needed a recharacterization of. I needed to find the eternalism in the fact that this is a continuous process, which William James offered. But you're completely right, and Deleuze and Guattari are right. Like, you are divine in the immanence of this moment, and so technically capitalism or this moment, it is divine. Like, look at what God hath wrought, for sure. Like, absolutely. And in better head spaces, that's the right way of thinking with it, because it calls to mind Death, one of the Endless from Neil Gaiman's Sandman books, right, where she says, in reference to someone who just died, I'm paraphrasing, but he got what everyone got, one lifetime. Right, so this is our lifetime. we lived through the explosion in the fireworks factory, and I don't want to I don't think we should spend it underneath blankets watching cartoons, but it kind of comes back to, we are imminently divine in this moment, and we are here, and it's not even. This is the trouble. You kind of fall into sequential or historical thinking to say you were born at this moment to do a thing, like you have a destiny, like maybe. But just on the purely phenomenological level, that as far as I can tell, this is the animist perspective, your sensory experience is the universe experiencing itself. And it's doing that right now. It's doing that right now in this moment. So I agree, like, we're in full alignment on that. I just get, unsurprisingly, more magical in the description, given that's where I'm coming from, I suppose.
Yeah. Big stuff.
Yeah, you quote death, and it gets pretty big, but I don't know, it is big. You sit with it for longer, as long as you can break out of, even break out of, as long as we can bracket or
the only thing I'd comment on there, I mean, depression is something, in terms of what it is, I'm super skeptical of, in the way that we understand it, in the way that we commonly understand it. I sort of actually moved towards, I guess you could almost call it a reactionary position from Gurdjieff, the idea that depression and anxiety, like negative emotions, are the things that we actually indulge in the most. And that seriously helped me out, because I think there is a lot of indulgence in it that comes from years and years of romanticism, Oscar Wilde, sort of these mopey, like Morrissey type figures, which I don't think is a correct representation of it, but I do think there's some indulgence in it. But then I also think that indulgence has been infected sort of parasitically by capitalism's understanding of what depression is, as basically depression and anxiety arise from an inadherence to normality within modernity, and people's inability to be normal because they can't be normal, because that's not them, and the conception of normal is a straitjacket.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes back to I could replace, every time you said the word capital, with the archon or archons, and it would be the same thing, right? Because it comes at you with you being a broken machine part. In the machine, it's like you actually have a chemical dysfunction in the brain. Okay, but that hasn't been true for 25 years. Like, there are still
feature, not a bug.
Yeah, but it's not. And I agree completely. When I say I manage it holistically, I just use the D word because that's what it is. But my experience of it is falling in and out of alignment with flow, essentially. So, and it's just been too much. Like, there's too much. Despair can do it. I tend to use the word despair more because it has kind of like more of a ancient Greek kind of feeling, rather than depression, which can, as you say, lead people down into an entrapping formulation.
Yeah, despair has the ancient connotations.
Yeah,
it's not this sort of minute. Trying to, should we say, like I guess even in Marxist language, it might be like a bougie liberal depression of, I don't know. It's just a sort of first world problem depression, as opposed to a true cosmic despair.
Agreed.
I don't want to, I mean, that's. I will admit that that's sort of a very fine line, because I readily admit, who am I to say what one is experiencing is X or Y? But just from personal experience, I've seen such an influx in it that I believe it's something that really is arising from one's inability to just say, actually, no, I'm fine with being this way, or I'm fine with being that way, and I'm fine with not doing that. That's one of the big problems of modernity, I find, is the inability to say no to anything. And feel comfortable in that decision to say, actually, one very, very obvious example is like we're all going out clubbing and binge drinking, and the all the social anxieties and pressures, and in a certain sense, what we understand within capitalism and depressions that come from saying no to that decision, that sort of communally accepted idea of what's correct for an 18-year-old to do, to say, no, actually, I don't want to do that. And it's in those moments of saying no to the presupposed normality that one sort of finds this this authenticity.
Do you think, because it's sort of in, I just want to be clear because I know people struggle with it. I view 2/3 of diagnoses of depression as being, obviously I do because I have a different theory of mind, as being despair, as being cosmic rather than a dysfunction within capitalism. It's all part of that battlefield medicine where they'll give you a thing to patch you up rather than fix it so you can toddle off and do more capitalism, right? But do you think, having said that, because I know there's some upset people who might be like saying we're telling them to harden the fuck up, cup of concrete, as we say in Australia, and kind of coming back to the cartoons thing, do you think this... do you think there's too much false consciousness in that? This is one of the things that I like Junger, and I think the exit is the correct move. But do you think there's false consciousness challenges, which I dislike, in kind of going, well, maybe you shouldn't do this and maybe you should do that? Because I think that I'm concerned about the infantilism. I think if people can, in an adult capacity, watch a cartoon, they should. And I think that's my soul for it, but I don't know. What do you reckon?
Just explain to me what you mean by false consciousness.
So in the Adorno sense of why communism didn't take off amongst the working class, particularly in America, it was because they had false consciousness. He hated things like jazz. He hated black things. He hated things like jazz and cinema and dancing. Like he was like the mayor out of Footloose, right? And his reason for why there wasn't this great working class revolution was because they had false consciousness. They were sort of, but it was that real European. He liked opera, and he looked at usual kind of leftist intellectuals, right? He liked opera, and he looked down on actual working class behaviors. But I worry that that's built in, and I'm not much of an Adorno fan, but not that it's built in, but I think there's a danger of slipping into having like a false consciousness, or pointing at someone who's behaving in ways that we don't enjoy, and saying like, you shouldn't behave like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm always wary of myself when I'm saying, someone asked me like the other day, if you could change the world politically, would you? It's like, no, because what I want isn't what everyone else wants. And I'm always skeptical of saying like people should do this or that. And I try to phrase it in the way of like, I'm still young, but me doing this and that in relation to my previous despair, in relation to the pointlessness of modernity, has brought me more contentment. So maybe you could try that. It's not like this is the only way to do things, But with respect to sort of this idea of false consciousness, is I think actually really brings us to probably the other big, if one of my big questions is what do we do? What do we do? How do we fix this? What is to be done? I think the other question that instantly for me can actually begin to mark out a way to solve that is what has happened to our relationship to death, suffering, and pain, which I think is super, super important. And I think a lot of this hiding under the blanket is clearly an avoidance of death and suffering. And this ties back to the occultist thing of, one of the first meditations for many, many traditional occultist schools is a meditation on the skull. It is, before anything else, an acceptance that you are finite, that your energy is finite, and you are going to die. And our avoidance of this means we don't take these risks, means we don't come out from the blanket, and means also we see pain and suffering as a once again as a bug and not a feature, as not as something to be learned from, but something that is incorrect. And it's something
Yes.
that Dmitry Orlov outlines, which is no one simply dies anymore. There's always a reason. Even if they died of old age, it's, well, actually, we did the autopsy and the final thing that gave out was their blood flow. And so you put it down to that. So what that actually means is there was always a cure. If we could have just had their blood thinner, or if we could have just been monitoring their heart more, modernity would have won. Death shouldn't happen. And that's the problem we're in. One of the big problems is that unconsciously, we have begun to understand within modernity that death isn't a truth, which it is. It's an eternal truth, but it's a bug. It's a glitch. It's like, if we could just get on top of it, it'd be fine. And one of the things I really truly hate is this current culture that's slowly growing of anti-aging. People who are trying to stop aging, and it's the most ridiculous thing, to the point where it actually I find it horrible, because there's so much riding on that word aging that it's like you're admitting to infantilism there, aren't you? If you don't want to age, well, so what? You want to remain a child. With aging comes many of the lessons of life. That's the point. And I think in that question of how we view death and suffering, we could move towards this, towards a greater understanding of false consciousness and why it is we've become subsumed in certain medias and certain behaviors.
Yeah, I think so. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with Michel Foucault, was this idea that, because I'm especially at the moment, very interested in biopolitics, and he sort of said that the state power was trying to extend into the realm of death as the sort of modern medical state apparatus complexified and become what it is now. It is in, and this is really iconic, this is just pure Gnosticism, but it's in a battle with death. It will not let our souls leave. And one of the ways it does, this is kind of my angle on it, like one of the ways it does that is to banish death from our lives. You can't have the corpses in your house, all of this stuff. And it's what this current biopolitical imposition upon us all relies on. It relies on our, not just our unfamiliarity with death to such an extent that we have no capacity to assess risk or anything around it, and it's baked in either intentionally or not. But he had this idea, which I liked, that that state power was trying to reach beyond death, and it's in the narrative of medicine, as you say. Like, even if someone dies of old age, no one just dies. Like, if they had the right medical treatment, people, well, it's a scam, so hopefully no one's planning on freezing themselves, but people were literally trying to freeze themselves. and it's so profoundly dysfunctional, and tragic. Like, this has always been and everywhere else and everyone else, including ourselves, maybe from go back 500 years, and it's kind of a lot better, have a memento mori. We have Saturn in the sky. We know that death is essential to have death to have meaning. And I don't mean like because you learn that your life ends. I mean, no, it's metaphysical. Like the fact that death is, we pretend isn't, and that's weird.
Yeah, and it's this brilliant episode of The Twilight Show, episode 28, season 1. I remember that for some reason. I can't remember what it's called, but it's the guy who he passes away, and then he believes he's in heaven, and his heaven is a casino, big flashy house with all these women, really hot women, and he begins playing the slot machines and the roulette tables, and he wins every single time, and then he's like chats to women, and they're just instantly into him. And basically in this world there's absolutely no struggle. And after a month or so of this, he's extremely bored to the point of absolute despair, because there's no suffering, there's no struggle, there's no grind, there's no small amounts of death which you have in these moments of struggle where you fail, right? And eventually, at the end he says, like, I thought you said that I'd gone to the good place. And he says, what makes you think this is heaven? And sort of has this horrible cackle, and this guy's stuck in an eternity where that's hell. Is an eternity where you have absolutely no existential friction in terms of what it is you desire, instant, like. And that's sort of what capitalism wants to do for people, is to say, like, you want this, you've got it. You want this, you've got it. And, it's an interesting question as to why we keep partaking in this stupid ritual of desire. But, that is hell, is no struggle. And you need that to be able to anchor and react to things in certain ways and actually learn.
You know what? Some of the things. So basically, what we're talking about there is a flow model again, because it's not just highs and lows; it's variation, and the absence of variation is archonic. We think it's heaven, it's capital, it's archonic, right? And I have a hot take as to how I could prove that, and that's high intensity interval training. So, because my father has had he spent, because he's a boomer, probably decades on an exercise bike in his office, and like a couple of hours a day, and he still ended up with heart disease and having the heart taken out and triple bypass. And he's still alive. He's just had a bunch of shit happen to him, right? It turns out that it's not actually an elevated heart rate. So you don't get your heart rate up and keep it elevated, and that improves heart health. That just damages it. It is, in fact, a variation between high heart rate and lower heart rate. So high intensity interval training, the highs and the lows, the variation in it is the thing that creates the health. And you would think, and it comes out of that same machine medicine, right? The sort of mid-20th century exercise theory was, well, you got to exercise the heart. You got to keep the heart rate up for a minimum of 7 minutes before you start to get effects and all this kind of stuff. And it turned out to be complete machinist crap, right? The thing to do for your heart is variation. And that's the thing to do with muscle growth and all the rest of it. And I like the hot take of being able to go from effectively bro science to a cosmic statement. But if you are magical or hermetic or some kind of animist, there is in fact a metaphysical quote unquote truth. The word's wrong, but you know what I mean, to the reality of something like variations in heart rate make your heart healthier. A steady state doesn't. So it's healthy to exit. That's what I'm saying, James.
Yeah, well, I think that applies across more things than you'd think. I mean, I remember when I first started learning to draw, because my previous background was art, learning to draw and learning to paint. And I lucked out that I had a tutor who was extremely well trained and taught me, how to paint and how to draw, so almost to a classical level, which is very, very rare these days. And the first lesson, and the lesson that he consistently taught, was tone. Yeah, the best example I can give, probably one of the best painters who ever lived, J.M.W. Turner. Look at any of his paintings, and there is what we're talking about here is these sort of hazy backgrounds, and then bang, an absolute sort of chasm or caesura of black or red. And there's these paintings where, it's a landscape, and then bang, there's just this red buoy in the middle of the sea. And that is what we call tonality, and there's the same thing Giordano Bruno was talking about in on the Shadows of the Ideas, the Umbris Idearum. It's this idea like you have to have this metaphysical spectrum of light and dark. You can't just have all light, you can't just have all dark, in the same way that a pencil drawing can't be exactly the same tone the whole way around, because it's very, very boring, in the same sense that any life, as you say with the heart, to actually be able to learn and anchor yourself, you have to have these moments of intensity. Same thing applies for Deleuze as well. He talks about intensity a lot in terms of the intensity of certain events within time. And we seem to be heading towards a state of, as I've said, the same, of like an atonality, where we try to remove tone altogether and everyone is immanent within the same tonality, because if everyone is individual to the peak extent of their individuality, then we're all the same thing, because none of it matters anyway, because we're just trying to constantly react. And by doing that, we're just washing everything else out.
Yeah, I'm into it. I think I agree completely. I think that's got to put the chaos in chaos magic, James. So anything else we want to chat about before we wind this up? And I hit you up for suggestions on additional, like, younger stuff. I'll have I think you can get Oymus Will pirated fairly easy on the internet now. I'm just going to say...
Yeah, and you can get it for about 50 quid.
Yeah.
I think you get about 50 quid as a paperback.
Yeah. So you can do that, or you can Google it.
Yeah, or you can Google it.
Yeah.
You want some recommendations for like Exit or Accelerationism? Or?
Yes, all of that. People, because there's...
Accelerationism... Oh, sorry.
Okay, no, you go.
Accelerationism, I would say read the Accelerationist Reader. And if you're really into it and you really like the idea, then me and Matt have a course. Like, I'm not trying to shill this, but me and Matt have a course on Accelerationism, which covers the philosophy and politics. And my book on Accelerationism is being published on the 31st of this month. Accelerationism, Capitalism, Critique, which is specifically on the philosophy of Accelerationism. As for Exit, Oymersville is fantastic. The Forest Passage by Junger as well. His Paris War Diaries is great as well.
I haven't read that. I'm going to read that.
I'd also recommend Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, who I recently interviewed, who you might have heard of. But his recent stuff, Grey Mirror of the Nihilist Prince, is fantastic. But that's just on a Substack. I think you just have to subscribe to it. But it's one of those moments where my mind goes, you've only ever read 4 books. So my mind's gone completely blank. I'm trying to think of like great novels of Exit. I mean, I could say Walden. I would also recommend actually The Way Home by Mark Boyle, who is this Irishman who used to be in business and marketing. And then he was in a load of eco sort of pro-environment non-profits, and then he just moved to a should we say shack and lives without technology, and he documented it in a book called The Way Home, which is in terms of practical exit, probably one of the best books going on that. Rand Priere, I'd recommend his blog, just randpriere.com. And John Michael Greer, I'd always recommend John Michael Greer for just anything. Just read Greer.
Nice one. And obviously, where do they go to find out more about yourself and your show? If you're listening to this, like from Rune Soup.
Yeah, I need to now we'll do the inverse with you in a second. But so for Hermitix, it's HERMITIX, Hermitix is in the 9th tarot card, but all one word, .net, or it's hermitix.podium.co, or on Twitter, just type in Hermitix podcast, you'll find it. And then for me personally, it's meta_nomad on Twitter, or meta-nomad.net. And yeah, that's where you'll find, I'm doing a lot of, I think I'm doing a lot of the same stuff as you, Gordon, and Rune Soup, just interesting discussions on philosophy, occultism.
You get way more of the kind of like left academic stuff. I love listening to. I'm a keen listener to the show. I'm a big fan. So, but I think we're toiling in the same vineyard, if you will.
Yeah, but I spoke about this with Justin Murphy. I'm really glad we did this, because I don't know if you found this, but I found it hard to find people who are actually very open to do this, because there's like a hostility of competition. But it's like one thing I was trying. You haven't found that?
No. I mean, like, no, I reject that. I am not.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Right. But one thing me and Justin Murphy said is actually like these things are better for everyone, because people don't realize how incredibly tiny this sphere is at the moment, and it could just grow and grow and grow. And that was the whole point, is making this stuff accessible to people. So like, I'm glad we did this in a way. Well, I'm glad we did this generally, because there is this like hostility of like, no, it's my podcast and you're not stealing the viewers. It's like, that's not going to happen. We just want to chat. So
very nice.
But for Hermitix listeners, what would you recommend with respect to the occultist stuff you've been talking about? And you mentioned a lot about the animist worldviews, and I know you've recently published some stuff. So all about you. Where do we find Rune Soup? Where do we find your blog?
Yeah, cool. So runesoup.com is where you'll get the blog, and obviously the show is there, and you'll find Rune Soup. That's the name of the show as well in your various podcatchers. I'm Gordon, GORDON_White, WHITE on Twitter, although I am very time restricted on Twitter at the moment, and that has been life-changing to kind of give myself. It was 4 minutes in July. I've bumped it up, but I spend less than 20 minutes on Twitter a day, and oh my God, I love it.
How do you manage that?
I just it was like giving up cigarettes, because if I'm waiting for something to load when I'm at my desk, I will pick up my phone to look at Twitter. Yeah. What the fuck? Right?
How do you get out of that?
Oh, well, I was just so deeply dissatisfied with it at the end of June, beginning of July, that I'm like, I'm out of here. You guys are trash. And I say that I love a whole bunch of people on Twitter, but like, Twitter is trash. I'm out of here. 4 minutes a day, life-changing. It was. I gave up Facebook a decade ago now, and that year I wrote 3 books. Well, 2.5, and I finished the other one the next year, because it was the same compulsive action.
On Facebook?
There's a Rune Soup Facebook page where I share the show and some kind of Rune Soup articles, but I don't spend any time on it. And I only set that up once I could log in effectively as the page and not log into my own one.
Can you do that?
Sort of. Like, you don't show up.
You have like a dead account.
Yeah,
right?
people have asked my family if I'm dead because nothing is. I didn't even bother close. I can't close it because you need an active Facebook account, but nothing's happened on it in 10 years. So people have asked my family if I'm dead, and that seems to work. But I don't spend as much time on Twitter as I once did, and I recommend it, frankly, especially.
What positives have you seen from that?
Mental clarity. Here's the weird thing. It is a bamboozler, and you don't and I don't mean mental clarity like, oh, I didn't need to see that, but I think that's part of it. I think it's just people vomiting their shadow all over you. And even if you think you can put it down and you're not affected by it, but you sort of are, just as you're scrolling through people. We mentioned the sort of epidemic of pseudo depression. That's Twitter, right? And that impacts you. Looking at bad shit impacts you. I know that sounds like it shouldn't be profound, but we seem to forget that it's the same thing with taking a news diet, right? And that was transformative. And I just, it coincided, we did Dry July, which in Australia, because it's winter here, that's the month, it's kind of like the national, hey, I'm taking a month of alcohol, do you want to sponsor me kind of thing? I just did it because I needed to take a month of alcohol. So month of Twitter, month of alcohol. Oh my God. It was incredible. So yes, I am on Twitter. I do use it, but for people who are out there, like, consider talking about despair and exit and so on, try a couple of weeks of just doing either not being on it or restrict to 4 minutes. 4 minutes is usually enough for replies and messages. As for books and things like, or further stuff on animism in the members area, I'm shilling my stuff, but it's cheaper to be a member and watch some of the presentations on animism in the bonus member material area around Charles Ford and animism and so on. But in terms of other readers, we take the premium members through some people who didn't make it to the dinner party, but were there because I was there and Ursula was there, like Dr. Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, anything by Tim Ingold, Perceptions of the Environment. So academics who are operating, well, I'm very interested in academics who are operating from a place I identify. So their theory of mind is animist, and Tim is more there than Donna. We're best friends, and so I'm using their first names. But if you're looking for, okay, what does it look like when you turn a non-European or a more animist theory of mind to something like critique? And I think you get that strongest with Donna Haraway and Tim Ingold.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like a good place to finish up.
Nice one. All right.
Nice one. Thanks for coming on.
How do you reckon? Do you reckon this was a Swapcast? What do you think? You think we did good?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're both clearly clutching at our youth, using a word like Swapcast. So I'm going to say that as little as possible. Yeah. Well, I don't actually know how old you are. So
cool.
Yeah. No, I think it was successful.
If you're already familiar with Hermitix, you'll know that James doesn't do an outro, just boom, episode done, which sounds pretty tempting to me right now after editing a 2-hour show with a few dropouts. Sorry about that. But you know what? I quite like doing my outro, so I beg your indulgence for a little longer. I've been thinking about exit versus permaculture, right? In the sense that Bill Mollison called permaculture a benign form of sedition. And I was almost going to make the case that it is a more peaceable, gardeny form of exit. But I just think it sounds a little less metal, is all. Arguably, it is more violent, right? Because at least by the thinking contained within something like accelerationism, sedition is an action without, or rather within, the hypothetical footprint of the state, whereas exit is just like the gif of Jerry Seinfeld getting up at the cinema. So maybe exit wins there, but useful as I find accelerationism to think with, and I will continue to do so where appropriate, it does seem in many respects like an unnecessarily unhaunted redescription of Gnosticism. That's not at all surprising. at least one of its leading thinkers was explicitly downstream from Derrida in trying to use magical terms like hauntology and weird and eerie in a frankly materialist context. And that's always been a personal irritant of mine and probably yours, because these terms often get bent to the point of uselessness. And I can't escape the feeling that it's, to borrow a little of the showmanship appeal of the quote-unquote supernatural, like when Richard Dawkins describes his terrible book as the greatest show on earth, right? And it's a pity. And it reminds me of something Connor said when I was staying with him in LA the other year about Deleuze and Guattari, not about, although they're upstream from accelerationism, and how he wished they were less squeamish about occultism at the beginning of their careers, so that they didn't have to effectively invent their own, like their own version of it. And in his parallel universe, they spent their careers working within some kind of living cosmos framework. And that would have been certainly more valuable to us, but it would have been very interesting if you could wind them back to the beginning of their careers and make them explicitly Hermetic or something, right? And see what happens. But hey, maybe that's all our work for the next 10 years. Like an understanding of gender that enshrines it as an interior expressing into the exterior in a flow model is a good example, right? And I've mentioned on previous shows that that's how you end run around the turfs, for instance. Animist essentialism. Ask for it by name. Anyway, that's this week's show. Got some other experiments format-wise coming up, as well as some classical configurations, so be sure to stick around for them both. Until next time.